How's it going? Welcome back to my Homestead Classroom. Today we are in the kitchen, not the garden, because I am doing a whole bunch of canning and I wanted to take you guys along. So you can can with me. I'm doing cherries today. This is what's left, but I had 2 more bowls that were actually larger than this, full of cherries. What I'm doing with them is 3 different recipes. I'm doing from the Ball Blue Book of Preserving, their recipe for Danish Cherry Sauce and Brandied Cherries. And then from the Ball Complete Book of Home Preservation, just their basic cherries and sauce. And that one I'm doing to be kind of like a cherry pie filling. So getting those 3 recipes put up, lots of jars already. And this last recipe that I've got going is just the cherries and sauce. So if you have never canned before, crash course real quick. There's 2 different kinds of canning: water bath, which is what I'm doing today, and pressure canning. They're used for different foodstuffs, water bath being used for high acid foods, and that's what the cherries and the sugar is. With the acidity level going by the recipe, I don't have to worry about that. So with the water bath canning, it's a giant pot of water that you have a rack like this, wire rack. I'll end up putting this in the water with the jars on it and allowing it to be submerged in boiling water for a set amount of time as determined by the recipe. And that's going to do 2 things. That's going to seal the jar, but it's also going to kill any bacteria in there and keep my food safe. So that's the 2 main concerns with canning, is getting a sealed jar, but also making sure the conditions inside the jar are safe for you to eat, free of bacteria, not breeding anything in there. So pretty much all you need for water bath canning is a big enough pot to be able to put your jars submerged under 1 inch of water. So you can buy ready-made canning, like graniteware, cookware for that, or if you just have a big enough stock pot with a lid, that's the key. You should be fine too. You'll also want to make sure you've got something that keeps the jars from being in contact with the bottom of the pot. That's what the wire rack is for. It also helps you lift it up and out, but if you're in a pinch or you can't find one, don't have one, one trick that I've learned is you can take extra mason jar rings that screw on the top and just layer them on the bottom of the pot, and that will be enough to keep the jars off and work as a rack, basically, keeping that space for you. So the first step in any canning project is getting the jars, the lids, the rings clean. Already did that today. I do the rings and the lids by hand in the sink and soapy water, and I do the mason jars in the dishwasher just because I have a large enough project that I've got so many to go through. And for the cherries, last night I actually prepped those up, and it was a lot because I got close to 20 pounds of cherries. One thing that made prepping all these cherries a lot easier, though, is this tool designed to remove the pit from the cherry. There's lots of options out there on the market, but my thing was I wanted to find something that would allow me to process as many at a time as possible. And for the most part, I was seeing ones that, like, you screw on a mason jar top and you can do 1 cherry or maybe 2. I found this thing at Meijer. It's OXO brand. It does 6 cherries at once. This thing is so cool. It made it so much faster. It opens up to be able to fit on different size bowls. So there's this holder here. Put that down over the little container that'll end up catching all the pits, and you just put 6 cherries in there. Take this lid, slam it down. It punches all of the cherry pits into this container. And my favorite part is as you pull it up and back, it gets to this point, and then you can, and it actually pops the cherries off and they fall down into the bowl. So completely hands-free for the most part. You're just loading the cherries in there. So I got all the cherries washed, pitted, and then I put them in a bowl of water with citric acid. It's something that you can find in a bottle. It's a powder in the canning section. And that just made it so that the cherries that I took the pits out, now that they had this open wound in them, it prevented them from browning. So I got them all processed in the fridge, let them sit overnight, and then this morning I was able to start with the cleaning of the jars and everything. My kitchen counter typically has, like, you know, a toaster and other kinds of things, but when I'm canning, I like to clear all of my normal stuff off the counter, move it somewhere else, get everything completely clean and sanitized, and then start working, because I like to treat my kitchen as, like, a commercial kitchen. You know, I've worked in restaurants a lot, and being clean and working in a kitchen clean is a really huge deal, especially since I want to give a lot of these as presents to people. I want to make sure everything is nice and clean, tidy. It also makes it so that cleaning up is a lot easier down the road. So let's introduce you to all of the tools and utensils that you're going to need for a water bath canning project. They're all pretty much the same. Whatever you need to cook the recipe. So this one's pretty straightforward. I just need a stainless steel pot. I'm using a wooden spoon to mix. I've got a glass measuring cup to get the sugar measured out, but whatever the recipe calls for to cook. And then the actual canning tools itself, you can find a set that comes with all these, which is why mine are all matching green. But some kind of funnel is really helpful to put on the jar as you are ladling the product into it. My clean rings and lids. This is a tool that's specifically made for canning. This end, when used like this, goes down in the jar, and after it's filled, you use it to get all of the air bubbles out. And then down on the bottom, you can't really see on camera, but it has these marks are labeled on top with, this one right here is an inch depth, and it goes all the way down to a 1/4 inch. Canning recipes are going to call for a certain amount of headspace. That is the distance between the lid and the product that's in the jar. It's specified for a reason. Each recipe, each foodstuff needs a certain amount of headspace to make sure that it's not going to boil over and out, to make sure that it seals properly. To ignore that, you might risk all of your jars, you know, not sealing, not being able to be stored properly, and that's, you know, ultimately not what you're looking for with canning. So that's really great for headspace. I also have this little thing because I actually like using something else to pop the bubbles, so that way I don't get all of this dirty. And then there's tongs that come, and what that's going to be used for is just pulling the empty jars off of the rack. Basically, I'm going to get to a point where my stuff is ready to go and get jarred up. I'm going to have this lid off. I'm going to have the rack hanging on the edges of the pot with my empty, clean mason jars sitting on that rack. And sitting over that steaming water is going to help them heat up. And I want to make sure that I'm using nice hot jars for the hot food stuff that I'm then going to put into the hot boiling water. If I'm not keeping a semi-consistent temperature across all of those things, that's going to lead to breakage, and, you know, having a giant boiling water full of broken glass, not really what I'm looking for either. So that's what that's going to be used for. And then I've also got this rag here with just a little bit of water on it. That is for wiping the rim of the jar before you put the lid on, again, to make sure you have a proper seal. One little tip: if you are canning anything that is going to have any kind of a fatty content, that's going to be pressure canning. So anytime you're doing anything with meats or something, if you dip your rag in actually a little bit of distilled vinegar, that will help to make sure there's no fat residue on the outside of your jar, preventing you from getting a seal. Just a little tip. And then over here, I've just got the rest of my cherries that I'm about to weigh out here. Food scale is really helpful because these recipes are calling for pounds of fruit, so I want to make sure I'm getting an accurate reading. And then I also like to have some distilled vinegar on hand. What I used this for was actually, I put a couple of just good glugs in the water bath canner. What that's going to do is keep my jars crystal clean on the outside when I go to pull them off. You can get a kind of like a white powdery residue, and it wipes off perfectly fine. That's just from the actual canner itself. It doesn't harm anything. It just means you've got to take the extra time to make sure it's all wiped off if you want, like, presentation-wise, the jars to look pretty. So that's what that vinegar is for. And then I have an electric kettle, which makes this part easier, but however you've got to do it, make sure you've got something where you can get more boiling water really quickly, either a kettle or a pot on the stove, because you need to make sure, once you've got full jars of food dropped in there, that there's an inch of water above the height of those jars. So if you need real quick to top it off, you can do that with the kettle. And then last but not least, I just have my setup for taking the jars out of the canner at the end and bringing them over to my finishing area where they're going to sit for 24 hours to cool. I've just got a little kind of drink tray here that I got at the Coca-Cola Museum in Atlanta, Georgia. And this is the other tool that comes with the whole canning set. This flat part is the handle, and that part there that's rounded grabs the jar. And I say that because it wasn't 100% obvious to me, even though it probably should have been. So once I've got them all out of the canner, I'll just take and load them on that tray, bring them over to my kitchen table where I just have some towels laid out, And here you can see I've already got, this is my batch of the Brandied Cherries. I've got labels made up for all of them already and off to the side, kind of grouped together. These are the Danish Cherry Sauce that I just got done with. And both of those recipes smelled fantastic while they were cooking, so definitely check those out. Those were available in the Fall Blue Book Guide to Preserving. Alright, so now we're ready to really kind of get started here. Got the water bath going and not getting it to a full rolling boil yet, but just getting that water nice and hot. And then for the recipe itself, the book actually lists two different methods that you can do. There is what's called raw pack or hot pack. It's basically just, are you going to cook the food first or not? In this case, I've decided to do the hot pack because that's essentially just going to be mixing the cherries with cups of sugar, heating it over low, medium heat until it kind of creates its own sauce. The raw pack method involves making a syrup on the side and kind of adding that to the raw cherries in the jar. And I just didn't want to have to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and get the cherries measured out and see how many pounds I'm working with. The recipe says you can use 8 to 10 pounds of cherries and 2 to 3 cups of sugar. That amount of sugar is a variance that allows you to adjust the sweetness to your taste. And I want to see how many pounds of cherries I have first before deciding how much sugar to use. So let's see. Three pounds of cherries. Alright. So here we go. I got just about 8 pounds. So with the 8 pounds I've got here in this pot, I want to go with 3 cups of sugar. And that's because I want this to go more of in like a cherry pie filling direction, and I'm going to need it to kind of get any thickness that it can. I can't add any cornstarch or anything like that to this. That is not an approved ingredient for canning recipes. What I can do after I'm done canning this, when I want to use it down the road, it's 1 tablespoon of cornstarch to 2 tablespoons of water. Whisk that together in a pan and add your jar of cherries, and that will actually thicken it up. Get it to a boil and just keep cooking it until it's thick. So that's one way to go about it. But so yeah, I'm just going to go with the 3 cups of sugar on these cherries and get that nice and mixed in. It's going to take a little bit to really let the heat kind of build. I don't want to, burn the bottom of the pot while it's cooking. I'm going to put a lid on it for a little bit and see if we can get that process going. The cherries are going to release their own juices, and basically it's going to cook down and dissolve that sugar in its own cherry juice. I think the flavor is just going to be better doing it this way by just adding the sugar to the cherries and cooking it down. It's not going to be a diluted syrup that I make of water and sugar that I add to the cherries. So I just think overall, flavor-wise, it's going to, for my time and effort, I want it to taste as good as possible. And 3 cups. Yes. Yes, it is a lot of sugar. No, this is not diabetic friendly. No, I don't really know how to do it any other way. I'm just following the recipe. That's why I buy a 10-pound bag of sugar. When you start getting into canning projects, there's a lot of sugar involved. Sugar is a preservative. And then I'm just gonna set this to a nice, I'm gonna set this to 4 to start, and I'm gonna slap a lid on it. I'm gonna slowly build up the temperature in here. This is just my cooking methods. This part isn't specific recipe. The recipe is to just cook it over medium-low heat until the sugar's dissolved and the cherries are heated through. So I am doing it this way because I think low and slow is the way to go. There will be several times when you're canning where you'll find there's downtime during the project. This is one of them. I'm going to be watching the cherries, so I've got to stick around here and make sure I'm stirring them and they're not burning, sugar's dissolving. But other than that, there's not a lot of hands-on stuff to do. So getting things cleaned up, staying on top of the dishes, things like that, really like any cooking project, are going to make your life a lot easier at the end of it. When you're exhausted in a hot kitchen, you don't have this mountain of tasks to get done ahead of you. Really just staying on top of the dishes, staying on top of just keeping the counter wiped down. When you know you're done using an ingredient, getting it put away. Those little teeny tiny things will add up to this nice, relaxing moment at the end where you realize you're done and everything's clean. I just have a pot full of sugar-coated cherries. Seriously, look at this. Doesn't that look delicious? But it's not ready. got some cleaning done. I'm going to go ahead and get my empty clean jars loaded onto the rack hanging above the water here. So like any lid on any hot pot, be careful when lifting the lid, tilt it away from you, be careful of the steam that's probably going to escape, the hot water that's going to drip off the lid, don't hurt yourself. And I usually just put the lid in the sink or just kind of off to the side for a second. And then this rack, you'll see on the handles, has these little divots on both sides, and that's where it's going to hang above the water level on the outside of the pot. I'll just take my clean jars, put it up here. Sometimes if you've got a lot of water in your canner, obviously the jars are empty, so they're not going to want to sit level, they're going to want to tip over. You just dunk them, add a little bit of water into the jar to keep it held down. No biggie. You can see this is how it's just going to kind of look. And then when I go to lift them to fill, I'm just going to grab and very carefully tilt that water out. Nice and simple. Just going to kind of check these. So this is actually the simplest recipe I've done all day. This is the last one for the cherries. But the other two that I already did were super simple too. The first one I did was the Brandied Cherries, and it's basically just cooking down sugar, water, and lemon juice, and then adding the cherries, cooking it all down, removing it from the heat, and adding the brandy. Because you cook the brandy, it's going to cook off the alcohol, and nobody wants that. And then just loading it into the jars, processing it for 10 minutes in the canner. That's it. And then the Danish sauce recipe was just sugar, a little bit of corn syrup, and then some cinnamon sticks and almond extract. And cook that all down, add the cherries, and let it kind of cook in its own. And then same thing, just load it into the jars, load it into the canner. Really, really easy. There is a lot of complicated recipes out there with canning, and I feel like a lot of people think it's entirely complicated because there are several steps to it, and most people end up hearing about the whole process with tomatoes involving the blanching and the peeling and all that kind of stuff. Now granted, I did have to pit 20 pounds of cherries, but the recipes also gave options for if I did not want to pit them. I'd still have to poke a hole basically in each of the cherries so they don't explode, but there's a way to not have to go through and do all that if you don't have access to that pitter like I do. Or of course you can also do smaller batches. With that, I did just kind of want to say, you probably noticed that I had two different size jars in there. One of them, the larger size, is pint, that's 16-ounce jars, and then half pints. With these recipes, they gave me instructions and processing times for a pint jar. The general rule with canning and safe canning is that you can take a recipe, and if it says one size jar, you can do anything smaller, but you just can't go up in a jar size. That's because of processing time. If I did larger jars, either A, it would require a longer processing time, and I wouldn't necessarily know exactly how long that should be. There's also a chance that at that much volume in that big of a jar, say a quart jar or larger, it ends up being too dense. The heat can't penetrate all the way through, and it doesn't do that second important thing of canning, which is make it an environment with no bacteria growing or anything like that. So yeah, general rule of canning, you can do smaller jar sizes for that same recipe. So this one says do pint jars. It says to process them for 10 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and do half pints as well to make it easier to give as gifts and things like that, or just eat smaller amounts of it at a time. So I'm feeling the same feeling that I had with doing the last two recipes. I haven't really ever cooked much with cherries before, but I'm looking at this pot and I'm like, oh my god, it's not going to be enough liquid, it's not going to reduce. I felt the same way with the other two things that I just canned, and it gets to a point where the cherries are really starting to seep out some of their own juices and cook in it. So I'm just telling myself, don't add water, just let it do its thing, it's okay. Why didn't you guys tell me I'm out of paper towel? There we go. Okay, finally got it cooked down, so this is what it ended up looking like. Plenty of liquid covering all of the cherries. So I'm going to take it off the heat, and I like to have this right here be my little staging area, so I turn the handles of the pot to the side so they're not in the way. And I'm going to start and do this one jar at a time, because you don't want the jars cooling down, which increases increases the likelihood that they'll end up breaking in the water bath. So I got my jar with my funnel, and I'll get this as close to it as possible to lessen the mess. I'll just scoop the cherries right up in there. Pack down nice and good. And then this recipe called for a 1/2 inch of headspace. So I'm going to take, and 1/2 inch is if the lid was resting on this spot right here. So I'm going to put it like, that's 1/4 inch, that is a 1/2 inch. I'm just barely touching the top of the food, so that is good to go. I'm going to take my little bubble popper. You can also use a wooden skewer. That actual like measuring tool works as one as well. I just don't like getting covered in gross while I'm using it. And just really sliding it down. You're not actually popping the bubbles. What you're doing is providing an escape for the bubbles. They just follow this stick all the way up. Here's that. Take and wipe the rim so that way there is nothing to prevent a good seal. Take your lid, seat it on there, nice and straight, and then screw on the ring. I like to do just fingertip tight. It's not going to be anything too crazy. Put it right back in the water. Smaller jar. These smaller jars are really nice for presents and things like that. As far as the straight up cherries go that I'm doing, we like to do hobo pies when camping, where you kind of sandwich 2 pieces of bread with some filling together in those cast iron sandwich makers for cooking. And we've done it with cherry pie filling that you can buy at the store. So I want to do it with some homemade stuff. It's really good, especially if you take cinnamon sugar and put it on the outside of the bread with butter before you put it in the cast iron with the cherry pie filling. Oh, so good. So yeah, having a tiny jar like this makes it really easy to have for something small like camping. Wipe the rim. That is the step that I have found I forget the most. I haven't for a while because I realized on my first couple of canning projects that that was something I missed. So I've really been trying to get everything set up, all the tools that I'll need before I even start, and that way I will include a rag to wipe down the rims with. That'll just save me from myself. So this last little jar is not too many cherries. I mean, it's more than half full of cherries, but it'll be great for, honestly, just like using like it's a jar of maraschino cherries for cocktails or something like that. No problem. It's also such a great feeling when you get the exact number of jars prepared that you need for your canning project. All of the recipes will typically tell you that it'll yield about this many pints or this many half pints, and that's all because you can't necessarily, those recipes have no idea how much your produce weighs, how big it is, how juicy it is, how much moisture is in it when it cooks down, so it's always an estimate, so when you nail it like I just, it feels so good. Okay, the next step is to lower this very gently into the pot. So really the key is just paying attention, grabbing both handles at the same time, keeping it level, and lowering it down in. When you load your jars into the rack, doing so in a way that the weight is evenly distributed is going to help you a lot right here. So nice and easy. Okay, And you can see here that there is an inch of water above the tallest jars. So there's more than an inch above those half pints. That's okay, you just need at least an inch above the biggest ones. So I'm going to go ahead and get the lid put on, turn up that heat, and get it to a full rolling boil. Once it's at a rolling boil, I'm going to set the timer for the appropriate time. We reached the point of a full rolling boil, so now 15 minutes on the clock. Okay, so battery's just about to die, but we did just get the beep that the timer is done. And the next step is to turn off the burner, take the lid off of this pot, and actually let it sit for 5 minutes just to cool down a little bit before we go ahead and remove the jars. Okay, now time to just pull these up out. For this, I like to have oven mitts because that wire rack is still pretty hot, still really hot water involved. This is also a good time to take the tongs and just rearrange the jars based on where they ended up moving when they were boiling, so that way everything's still evenly distributed on the rack when you go to pick it up. If they tip a little bit, that's okay, and you know what, even if they go to completely tip over, it's fine, just let it happen. It's boiling water, you don't want it to splash on you. Had it happen before and it's not fun. There we go. Easy up and out. Hook and hook. Alright. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this jar clamp. I'm going to start with the one in the center. And just like you're taking the lug nuts off of a tire, go in a star pattern so that way the weight is still evenly distributed. If you pull off half of the rack and not the other half, it is likely that it will tip over and again splash you with really hot water. Don't do it. There's also going to be water on top of the jar lids. Don't tilt the jars. They'll evaporate perfectly fine. It's a thing to make sure that your seal is good by not tipping the jars, so you don't want to do anything to jeopardize that seal. I'm just going to carry them over to my resting spot and get them set up. And just like that, we can cherries. Ta-da! Basically just leave them alone for 24 hours to make sure they're entirely cooled. The fun part is hearing them ping. The seals on them will actually pop as they finish sealing. So listen for those pings, wait for them to be done cooling, and then go ahead and check the seals and put your labels on, store them, and you're good to go. Thanks for hanging out with me today. See you next time for some strolling through the garden. Take care.